But while those are coming in, Kate, perhaps we could let George or IJ respond to some of your comments, initial comments to the paper.
Please go ahead. George, or IJ, since you went first, do you want to spend a moment?
Yeah, sure. So David and Catherine, thank you for the comments and feedback. They're all interesting points. David, it was interesting that you brought up the example of your own bank, which kind of expressed, the typical kind of actions that we think, banks are typically want to take when they're in trouble, not trying to grow out of their problems, but trying to, just find a way to survive, focus on capital preservation. I think that's what our paper is about. Of course, we have to be concerned about moral hazard. As always, it's a real thing. But most banks, when they get in that situation, are just in survival mode, we feel. And I think that's a great point that you brought up. Catherine, you brought up a lot of points, and these are things that we've looked at and continue to look at. I'll just respond to one or two of them. You mentioned, made a point about granularity and measuring distress, and why did so many banks still fail, and questions like that. Well, I want to note that the measure of distress is somewhat arbitrary, and one of our concerns is that we capture banks that are distressed but ultimately survive, and kind of miss the banks that fail. We try to mitigate that in a few ways. I mean, and I don't have time to discuss all of this, but you use a 1 quarter horizon too. It's implausible that that drives the results, focus on a 1 quarter. We also look at failed banks, and interestingly, we find that failed banks take much the same actions as the banks that we categorize as distressed. The only difference is they're not surprisingly unable to raise sufficient capital to deal with all the losses that they've incurred. But they still shed assets, they still reduce their liabilities, they still pay less for deposits. So they're exhibiting almost all of the things. They close branches, they reduce employees, they do all those things. So in terms of the change after Dodd-Frank, so that's something we're still looking into. I mean, we did find that the banks had more trouble increasing their equity, during the GFC, except for the TARP banks. But interestingly, they seem to be even more aggressive in shedding assets and doing other things. So I think how they achieved this may have differed a little bit from crisis to crisis. Also, I'd note the GFC was more focused toward, Dodd-Frank was more focused toward large banks, and our sample includes everybody. So that could also explain why there's some difference on average when you look at those plots. But I agree that, some more granularity would be good, and we'll continue to look at those things and appreciate your comments.
Great. So George, I'm going to give you the floor, but before I do, I'm going to add another question in for you. So this is from our audience. Andrew Meyer asks, you note in the paper that banks no longer have access to this particular BIF-safe insurance differential in the U.S., but they might be able to exploit international differentials and premiums. Do you know of any specific examples?
Thank you, Catherine. No, I actually don't know of any specific examples of the international, any kind of similar behavior going on. This was just to say that banks actually do respond to those differentials, and internationally it's possible. I'm not sure what actually the laws are. I know there are laws against moving deposits and things like that, but sometimes those differences can create strong incentives to shift or migrate deposits. I mean, in the paper, between BIF and SAFE, SAFE institutions could save millions of dollars. And I talk about this in the paper annually. This wasn't just a one-time saving. It was an annual saving that they could get by moving some of the funds to the BIF if they could. Yeah. You're on mute, Catherine. All right. Okay, so I just want to thank you again, Catherine and David, for your comments. I just want to respond. Catherine, I totally agree with you on the baseline for optimal level of risk. I think that's a very difficult question, and I'm very happy that I'm not making any decisions on where that level is, the optimal level of risk. It's a trade-off. The paper is kind of agnostic on this. It's just looking at how banks respond to risk-based pricing when there are differentials in premiums. But I definitely agree that it could help the framing to talk about where that level is and the different trade-offs that are involved. And David, I want to thank you again. I also I'm glad to hear that it makes a difference to the bank's decisions how much they pay in deposit insurance premiums. I think it makes perfect sense. It's just hard sometimes from a high level looking at many different banks to know what those differences are. But like you said, and like the paper finds, there are actually very big differences that could affect the bank's risk behavior.
Absolutely.
Mark here. One additional question from the audience. Can we ask if their research uncovered other areas they'd like to explore on a topic they hadn't thought of? So both these papers certainly lay the groundwork for further questions or deeper inquiries. Any thoughts from either of our authors today?
So the Federal Home Loan Bank issue, I talk about that, and this also goes to your point, Catherine. I really want to explore that more. I have not explored it very much in the paper. I just found that the shift in funding sources was through the Federal Home Loan Bank, but I have not explored that. That's definitely one area I would like to explore more.
One of the areas that we thought about exploring more are something related to, Catherine, one of the points you made, what defines, what levels of distress matter in terms of what banks do. Why do some banks who try to deleverage succeed and some fail? I think that's an important question to address and something we hope to look into.
Great. Well, thank you again for two wonderful papers. David, thank you for your thoughtful comments. This was a great session. I know I learned a lot from both of you, and I look forward to seeing where both of these projects end up. Thank you.